Hello, traveler. You're tired, and it's time to rest. We've gathered by the campfire to relax and listen to ancient stories. Grab your cup of warm drink and join us. Let this starry night completely capture our attention. In the hush of a world that had once known dragons, a breeze moved softly across the scarred hills of Summerhall, brushing its forgotten stones with the gentlest of hands. It was as if the very wind remembered fire that reached for the sky, laughter of kings now ash and bone, and the last cries of dreams shattered beneath flame and smoke. The old keep, long reduced to crumbling towers and blackened arches, stood silent, embraced by ivy and moss, and somewhere within its sleeping stones, something pulsed faintly, something old, something waiting. Ilaris Targaryen, youngest daughter of a dwindling line, moved through the ruins with the slow, deliberate grace of someone searching for a dream long feared to be lost. Her hair was pale silver, like the mists that clung to the veil at dawn, and her eyes, lilac and shadowed with wonder, reflected the past as much as the present. She had come here alone, as the stars above whispered secrets to those who still listened. As the histories grew quieter with each turning year, the world no longer made room for dragon lords. Their castles were fading, their words forgotten. But Ilaris was not ready to let go. The parchment she carried was yellowed and thin, edges crumbling like burnt leaves. It had been hidden in the library of Dragonstone, buried beneath generations of dust and disdain. Her fingers had trembled when she read the final passage aloud, her voice barely a whisper. Where fire fell, one hope endures. It was not much. A riddle, perhaps, a prayer. But it had been enough to bring her here. She stepped over a charred beam, its iron nails rusted red like old blood. Summerhall was a grave, yes, but also a cradle, once. A place where kings dreamed of rebirth. The last dragon died here, they said, though none could remember its name. And here she now stood, barefoot and alone, among bones and shadows. The sun dipped lower, casting the sky into hues of crimson and gold, and the air thickened with the silence of memory. And then she heard it, a sound so faint it might have been nothing more than the creak of settling stones, but to her it was as clear as a bell. A heartbeat, not her own, but something deeper, slower, ancient. It came from beneath the chapel ruin, where the stones still bore the heat of the fire even after all these years. Her breath caught in her throat. She knelt, brushing aside the vines and soot, revealing a circle of blackened tiles. Her fingers moved with reverence, tracing the scorched sigil of her house. A three-headed dragon, wings curled in descent. Ilaris pressed her hand to the center. At first, nothing happened, only the whisper of the wind through hollow arches. But then the stone warmed beneath her touch. A hum rose from the earth like a low chant, and the tile shifted. Dust billowed upward, and the ground gave way to a hidden hollow, revealing a space carved into the earth, untouched by time or air. Inside, cradled in a cradle of obsidian and wrapped in faded red silk, lay the egg. It was not large, no larger than a man's helm. Its surface was scaled in crimson and gold, veins of black twisting like veins of fire through its shell. It pulsed with heat, not hot enough to burn, but warm like embers hidden in ash. She lifted it slowly, holding it as one might hold a newborn child, and the moment her fingers closed around it, the heartbeat grew stronger, steady, sure. Tears welled in her eyes, unbidden. For a moment she could hear them, her ancestors long past, voices calling from the flames. The song of fire, the song of blood. She stood in the twilight of Summerhall, cradling the last breath of a dying house, and felt the weight of destiny settle upon her, shoulders like a mantle of stars. She did not sleep that night. The egg rested beside her on the stone, and she sang to it in the old tongue, words she barely remembered but which rose from her lips like a forgotten lullaby. In her dreams, flames danced and wings soared. A beast with eyes like suns curled in the depths of her mind, and when she awoke, she swore she had heard it whisper her name. The morning came veiled in fog, and with it a choice. She could return to Dragonstone and present the egg to the maesters to be studied and caged, dissected for lore and locked away. Or she could follow the call that stirred within her blood, the fire that whispered of skies untouched, of ruins reborn. She had no rider's training, no warlocks or priests, only a heart full of stories and a name that once meant something. Alaris Targaryen wrapped the egg in wool and silk and set off with dawn at her back. The road was long, and the lands she crossed bore little love for dragonkind. In towns she cloaked her hair and eyes, passing as a common girl with a merchant's satchel. She ate little, spoke less, and kept the egg close to her chest. At night she would find a quiet grove or an abandoned barn and whisper to the egg, her voice steady despite her weariness. "We are not alone," she would say. "Not yet." It was in one such village, no more than a scatter of thatched roofs and smoking chimneys, that she met Maester Caden. He was old, his robes patched and frayed, his chain tarnished with age. His eyes, however, were sharp, like flint beneath snow. He had been tending to a sick child when she first saw him, his hands careful, his voice a calm thread amid panic. When their eyes met across the square, something in his gaze lingered, not recognition, not yet, but suspicion edged with curiosity. They spoke little at first. She watched him from afar, noting the way he listened more than he spoke, how he favored books written before the conquest, how his fingers trembled when turning pages, yet steadied when stitching wounds. One night, as the village lay beneath a blanket of frost, he found her sitting by the fire behind the inn, the egg hidden beneath her cloak. "You're far from home," he said, his voice gentle but pointed. She said nothing. He studied her in the firelight. "And what is it you carry so close, child of flame?" At those words she turned to him. "You know." He nodded once. "I have studied fire long enough to know its weight, even when hidden. That is no stone you hold." Her hand tightened on the bundle, but he raised a hand, palm open. "Peace. I have no wish to take it from you, only to understand." Willeres hesitated, then unwrapped the egg just enough for the firelight to catch its gleaming surface. Caden's breath hitched. "Gods preserve us," he whispered. "No," she said. "They will not, but perhaps fire will." They sat in silence then, two relics of an age long past. one born of blood, the other of thought, each weighed by a different grief. And from that silence, a strange alliance was born, not of equals, but of necessity. And so the journey began anew. The days that followed stretched wide and deep, like the plains they crossed beneath sallow skies. Illyris and Maester Caden became an odd pair, one clothed in the faded wisdom of ancient order, the other wrapped in prophecy and the scent of fire yet unkindled. Their journey was not marked by haste, for haste was a companion to chaos, and both of them knew that the path ahead required patience, not speed. They moved quietly from hamlet to hamlet, keeping to forest roads and forgotten ways, speaking only when the wind stilled enough to carry words without watchers. The Maester, for all his age and weariness, proved an insightful guide. He spoke of the world not as it was, but as it had been, when Old Town's beacon still flickered in the dreams of the realm, and Valeria's shadow reached across the oceans. Yet there was a bitterness to his tales, a restraint in his speech when dragons arose in conversation. He did not say it aloud, but Illyris could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing against the silence between them. He feared what she carried, not the egg itself, perhaps, but what it represented, the rebirth of an age long extinguished, and the cost that would surely come with its return. One night, as they camped beneath the twisted limbs of a gnarled oak tree, the stars above them blinking like the eyes of curious gods, Caden broke their usual quiet. The fire between them crackled, and the egg, as ever, lay nestled within Illyris's furs, its surface warm with a steady pulse. "You know," he said, stirring the embers with a branch, "when Valeria fell, it wasn't in silence. The world screamed. The earth opened, the skies burned, and dragons, those proud lords of sky and flame, were consumed by the very fires that birthed them. Magic is not a gentle art. It devours as often as it gives." Illyris looked at him, her face pale in the firelight. "And yet you journey with me still." He did not look up. "Because the world has forgotten the price of peace, and someone must be there to count the cost when fire rises again." She let those words hang, her fingers brushing the egg's shell as one might soothe a restless child. "Not all fire consumes," she said softly. "Some warms, some lights the path." The old man chuckled, but there was no mockery in it, only the tired sound of one who has heard such hope before and buried it many times. "And yet," he said, eyes finally meeting hers, "we call that which warms and lights the hearth, not a dragon, but a candle." The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with thought, with meaning, with a recognition neither of them could yet name. And the egg, nestled close to Illyri's side, pulsed once, bright and soft, like a heartbeat answering the hush. As they traveled, the world around them shifted. Villages grew poorer, their roads more broken. Lords' banners flew lower, and rumors clung to tavern corners like cobwebs in forgotten cellars. Whispers of unrest, of sickness in the land. A boy with silver eyes had been seen at the Trident, glowing like starlight before vanishing into mist. A fire had erupted in the Reach, sudden and unexplained, consuming an orchard in the shape of a great wing, and in the vale a shepherd swore the moon had blinked, only for a shadow like a great beast to pass beneath it. Illyris listened to each tale with quiet intensity, while Caden's brow furrowed deeper with each telling. He wrote them down at night, recording not only the words but the tones, the trembles in each voice, as if searching for some unseen thread that tied it all together. "The world is stirring," he muttered one evening as they crossed the stony path toward the Stormlands. "It remembers what it should have forgotten." Aelius did not respond. She sat beside a stream, the egg in her lap. Her reflection wavered and doubled upon the water. She had begun to dream more often. Strange, vivid dreams filled with wings and flame, of cities that floated and towers that bled light. A voice called to her in these visions, always just out of reach, always just at the edge of knowing. It was not her ancestors, not Visenya or Aegon or Rhaenyra. It was older, deeper, and it did not speak in words, but in flame. That night, her dream came differently. She stood upon a field of white ash. The sky above her churned black and crimson. Winds howled, but there was no sound. All around her were bones, not just of men, but of dragons. Skulls the size of wagons, spines like twisted spires, and in the center of that desolation stood a tree, leafless and charred, its bark carved with sigils that bled smoke. Hanging from its branches were crowns, iron, gold, bone, symbols of kings lost and broken. One crown pulsed faintly with light, and beneath it a single egg rested in the ash, its glow pulsing like a fading star. When she awoke, the fire had gone cold, and the egg lay still. Caden sat nearby, watching her with a gaze sharp enough to cut stone. "Another dream," he said, not a question. She nodded. There was a tree, and death, but also something waiting. He did not answer right away. He rose, poured tea into a dented cup, and handed it to her. "Dreams are strange beasts," he said, staring into the fireless pit. "Sometimes they are only echoes, other times they are roads. The danger lies in not knowing which." And so they continued. The nearer they came to the reach, the more strange things they encountered. Flocks of birds flying in perfect circles for hours before dropping dead from the sky. Fields where no crops grew, though the soil was dark and rich. Children with silver hair born to parents with none. A baker in Bitterbridge who wept each time he kneaded dough, swearing the flour whispered to him. All were signs. All were warnings. But Alarius did not turn back. She could not. For as strange as the world became, the egg grew stronger. It no longer needed fire to keep warm. It glowed now, faintly from within, a dull crimson that deepened when held close to her chest. Sometimes, when she sang to it, the light pulsed in rhythm with her voice, as though it understood, as though it remembered. And the dreams, they came faster. Not all were of fire and ruin. Some were of flight, of wind tearing past her cheeks, of clouds splitting beneath wings vast as mountains. She rode through lightning and storm, her hair a banner behind her, her hands gripped around warm scaled hide. A roar echoed through her chest, not of fear but of belonging. These dreams she woke from breathless, her heart hammering with joy and sorrow alike. On the edge of Blackhaven, they stopped. It was a village of stone and thorn, built high against a cliff where the wind sang day and night. Caden had friends there, an old healer and her mute brother, both kin to an age when dragons flew above Storm's End. They welcomed the travelers with cautious eyes, but gave them shelter, food, and peace for a time. Ilaris used that time to rest, to think. She sat often by the cliff's edge, the sea stretched vast before her, the egg warm in her lap. She wondered what it would be like to fly, truly fly, to carry not the weight of history, but the breath of what might be. One morning, as the first light broke across the waves, she heard the egg sing. It was not a song made of music, but of feeling, a vibration deep and ancient that thrummed against her bones. She held it to her chest and wept, not from fear, but from the unbearable beauty of it. And in that moment she knew the egg would hatch, but not yet, not here, and not alone. The morning mist clung to the slopes of Blackhaven like a lover reluctant to part, its pale breath stretching into the valleys and folds of the land below. Ilaris stood at the cliff's edge, her cloak drawn tightly about her, not for warmth, but to anchor herself against the vastness of the world beyond. The sea roared beneath her, an endless expanse of dark motion, and above the sky burned with the soft embers of dawn. It was not just the cold, salt air that made her tremble. It was what she felt pulsing gently beneath the wool of her cloak, nestled close to her heart. The egg had stirred again in the night, but not as before. This time the rhythm was different, faster, more insistent, like a heartbeat awakening to its own power. The dreams had changed too, no longer vague flashes of fire and sky, but something more focused, more personal. She had seen her own face reflected in molten gold, had heard her name whispered not from memory, but from within. The dragon was no longer a future possibility. It was a presence now, a soul uncoiling behind its shell. The house that sheltered them was old and crooked, shaped by wind and time, its beams warped like driftwood salvaged from a long-forgotten storm. Caden spent his hours in the loft, poring over ancient texts he had begged and borrowed from the healer's modest collection. There was a heaviness in him now that had not been there before, a slow erosion of certainty. The signs were growing too numerous to be denied. Even the stubborn threads of rationality, those cords he had wrapped so tightly around his mind for a lifetime, were beginning to fray. He would not say it aloud, not yet, but she could see it in the way he watched the egg when he thought she wasn't looking. He feared it, yes, but more than that, he believed in it. And belief, for a man like Caden, was the final confession of a soul that had run out of denials. They stayed longer in Blackhaven than intended. The healer, wise and wordless in her compassion, seemed to understand without explanation. She brought Ilaris tea brewed from herbs that only grew in shaded glens, and ran her fingers gently along the egg's surface, as if remembering something long lost. Her mute brother, lean and silent, whittled wooden dragons in the evenings, placing them by the hearth without ever meeting her gaze. It was as though the small household had already accepted the truth Ilaris had only just begun to embrace. And in the soft hush of that acceptance, something ancient and invisible took root. But even peace, however tender, cannot shelter a secret forever. Word traveled faster than wings in the right mouths, and soon whispers reached Blackhaven. A girl with silver hair and purple eyes, a fire that flickered where none had been lit, an egg, not one of stone or story, but alive, real, the kind of story that stirs ancient loyalties and awakens older fears. One night, as Caden sat with ink-stained fingers and Alaris dozed with the egg against her chest, the knock came. Not gentle, but sharp and demand. 3 figures stood at the door, cloaked in black and trimmed with the sigil of a lesser house sworn to the Baratheons. Soldiers, but not official, mercenaries in the garb of men who no longer had a war to fight. Their eyes glinted with the sheen of gold promised, not honor earned. "We've come for the girl," the leader said, his voice hoarse with drink and salt. "Word is, she carries a Targaryen treasure, and the lords of Storm's End don't much care for dragons in their backyard." Caden did not rise. He simply looked up, eyes calm behind his spectacles. "There are no dragons here," he said. "Only travelers. And the wind." But the man only laughed, taking a step inside, uninvited. "Then you won't mind if we take a look." It happened quickly, too quickly. The silence that had cradled the house shattered like glass. Alaris rose, the egg clutched tightly in her arms, and backed toward the corner of the room. The fire in the hearth flared, unbidden. The wood snapped, and for a moment the shadows on the walls twisted like wings. The mercenaries hesitated, and in that sliver of hesitation, Caden moved. He did not raise a sword, for he had none. He did not speak spells, for he knew none. What he did was stand, slowly, deliberately, and look the intruders in the eye with a stillness that struck harder than any blade. And then he said one word, low and clear. The fire roared suddenly, unnaturally, leaping to the rafters. The mercenaries stumbled back, cursing, shielding their faces. And in that moment, the egg in Alaris's arms flared with heat, not painful, but pure alive. The room pulsed with energy, and a sound filled the air, not a roar, but the memory of a roar, echoing from a time before time. The mercenaries fled, stumbling into the night like men escaping a nightmare, never knowing what truly had happened, only that they had seen something meant for legends, not men. Later, when the fire had dimmed and the house settled back into silence, Alaris turned to Caden with wide, tearful eyes. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. He did not answer at first. He knelt beside the egg, now glowing gently, its warmth reaching out like a breath. He placed his palm upon it, and for the first time did not flinch. "It is waking," he said softly, "and the world is beginning to remember." The following morning they departed Blackhaven. There was no need to speak of why. Alaris rode with the egg secured tightly to her chest, her gaze distant, her thoughts consumed by what was to come. She no longer questioned the road. It had taken her too far for doubt. Behind her, Caden followed with slower steps, a man no longer led by logic but by something older and far more fragile, faith. They moved east now, away from the coast and toward the riverlands, seeking a place spoken of in firelit whispers, a place where dragon lords once trained their minds and dreams, hidden deep in the bones of the earth. The road narrowed as they passed into the heartlands of Westeros, where the fields stretched golden and dry beneath a pale sky. And in that silence, broken only by wind and wheel and hoof, the egg began to thrum louder, a rhythm now constant, alive. At night, Alaris could no longer sleep. The dreams were too vivid, too loud. She saw not just dragons, but memories, memories not her own. She stood in halls carved of obsidian, beneath murals that moved with flame. She held swords that hummed with light, and bent her head to listen to the tongues of fire priests long perished. She flew above kingdoms that no longer bore names, and sang songs to stars that had not shone in centuries. And always, always the dragon called, not with hunger, but with longing. It was not waiting to be born. It was waiting to be remembered. The road wound like a serpent through the bones of the riverlands, cutting through yellowed fields and over crumbling bridges where moss grew thick between the stones. Aeleris rode in silence, the egg cradled tightly in the curve of one arm, while her other hand gripped the reins of her mare. An old gray creature, more bone than muscle, loyal only in the way that weariness makes one steady. Caden rode behind, his own steed slow and patient, its hooves stirring up dry dust that floated like the ghosts of forgotten kings. There was little conversation now, for both traveler and maester had become pilgrims of a sort, drawn not by religion, but by something older and deeper, a call from the very marrow of the world, as if stone and sky and blood remembered a name whispered only in the moments before waking. The path had narrowed over the past week, hedged in by ancient forests that leaned inward like listeners. In the hush beneath their boughs, Aeleris could hear the whispers, soft, indistinct, but there nonetheless. She no longer questioned whether they were real. The egg had changed her, or perhaps awakened something long dormant. The girl who had once scoured Dragonstone's dusty halls for half-remembered stories had faded into a figure more elemental. Her dreams no longer felt like dreams at all. They were memories now. She flew through skies untouched by war, touched minds not her own, and stood among the bones of beasts whose names had been lost to time. In sleep she walked a path of flame, and when she woke, her breath still held its warmth. Caden, for his part, had grown quieter still. The change in him was not outward. He still muttered to himself while reading, still scolded his horse in mock dignified tones, still arched a brow at superstition with the practiced skepticism of a scholar. But within, something had shifted. He watched the world with the eyes of a man walking across thin ice, uncertain whether it would hold or swallow him whole. He kept a journal now, tucked in the fold of his robes, and every night by firelight he would record not facts, but feelings. Not knowledge, he had muttered once when he thought her asleep. Impressions, patterns. The weight of myth growing heavy enough to cast a shadow. They reached the mouth of the Vale of Near on the 12th day, just as the wind began to change. It was a strange place, seldom mapped, often dismissed by maesters as a tale invented by hedge knights and song singers. But the air itself told a different story. It carried a sweetness, as if the leaves breathed old perfume, and the land seemed to dip not merely into shadow, but into memory. Aeleris dismounted at the edge of the path, her boots sinking into soft loam. Before her, a low arch of twisted trees formed a natural gate. Their branches nodded like hands clasped in solemn promise. The egg pulsed strongly now, as if it recognized the air, the earth, the silence. Without speaking, she stepped beneath the arch, and Caden followed. What lay beyond was not a valley in the usual sense. It did not open wide to sky or scatter light through endless meadows. Instead, it folded inward, as though the land itself had curled into slumber. Ancient trees rose on either side, thick and patient, their trunks carved with spirals of moss and glyphs worn by centuries of wind. Small pools reflected broken light, and here and there ruins jutted from the undergrowth. Arches of black stone, windows that opened onto nothing, staircases that climbed into empty air. The remnants of something vast and forgotten, not a city, no, something quieter, more sacred, a place built not for life, but for remembering. They made camp in the shell of what might once have been a watchtower. Vines claimed the walls now, but the stones beneath still bore the etched pattern of wings. As dusk fell, Alara sat in the middle of the tower's broken floor, the egg placed before her like an offering. She did not speak. She did not need to. The air around her shimmered faintly, as if listening. The firelight danced across her face, and in her stillness, she looked less like a girl and more like a statue from a forgotten age, a guardian carved to wait out centuries. And the egg responded, glowing soft and steady, its warmth a breath between heartbeats. That night the dream came again, but this time it was not a vision seen from afar. It was within her. She stood in a vast cavern, its ceiling lost to darkness, its walls lined with shelves not of books, but bones. Each ribcage, each skull, each claw and horn had been placed with reverence, a library of what once was. In the center stood a great stone altar, and upon it lay not one egg, but 3. Crimson, silver, and gold. She stepped forward, barefoot, the stones cold beneath her, her breath fogging in the air, though there was no wind. She reached toward the eggs, but before her fingers could touch, a voice spoke, not aloud, but inside her, resonating through bone and blood. Not yet. She turned. Behind her stood a figure cloaked in ash and light, its face shifting like smoke over embers. It had no eyes, but she felt its gaze. It raised a hand, and from its palm fell a single scale, black as night and veined with red. It struck the ground with the weight of prophecy. You are flame, but you are also choice. And then she woke, gasping, the air around her filled with the scent of burning cedar. The egg was no longer by her side. It sat at the center of the chamber, pulsing furiously, radiating heat in waves. Kaiden was awake, his eyes wide with awe and dread. I saw them, she said, her voice hoarse with wonder. The others, the beginning, and I was not alone. Kaiden nodded slowly, kneeling beside her. Then it is almost time. Alaris looked down at her hands, trembling slightly. What if I am not ready? To that the Maestra said nothing. He only placed a hand on her shoulder, heavy and steady. No one ever is. But outside, beyond the quiet veil, the world had begun to stir. The dreams of fire had not gone unnoticed. Far to the north, ravens circled like shadows made flesh. In the courts of kings and the ruins of old citadels, the air grew restless. Old oaths remembered their names, and swords long buried began to sing in silence. The age of stillness was ending. And in the heart of the forgotten world, a dragon was waking. The days that followed passed not as days typically do, with the predictable march of sun to moon and back again, but like echoes of something larger, older, pressing through the veil of the present, time in the veil of Nalar, folded in on itself, like fabric pulled taut by a hidden hand. Ilaris moved through it as one might walk through a memory, each step familiar without understanding why. each breath seeming to inhale not just air but the weight of ages. She spoke less now, not from weariness, but because words were becoming too small for what she felt inside. The egg no longer glowed. It burned softly and steadily, like the coal that lies hidden beneath the ashes, waiting for the right breath to roar back into flame. Caden observed her with a scholar's mind and a mourner's heart. He knew what was happening, though no book had ever taught it to him. The transformation was not sudden, but it was inexorable. Alaris was no longer merely a vessel for a Targaryen name, no longer a curious child grasping for legacy. She had become a conduit between the world that was and the world that would be. It frightened him, not because he did not believe, but because he did, because belief once awakened carried its own burdens. And because power, true power, changed not only those who wielded it, but all who dared walk alongside it. On the fourth morning in the Vale, the earth shook, not a quake to split stone or tear trees from root, but a deep, resonant tremor that moved through the bones of the land like a breath being drawn. Birds rose from the trees in wild, spiral flocks, and the pools of still water in the glade shimmered with light not their own. Illyrius felt it before she woke, her dreams melting into the pulse of the egg. When her eyes opened, she found herself already standing, though she did not remember rising. The egg hovered slightly above the stone floor, spinning slowly, cradled by a nimbus of flame no brighter than candlelight, but purer, older. Kaidin knelt beside it, his lips murmuring prayers he did not know he still remembered. The walls of the ruined tower seemed to breathe with them. Ivy rippled without wind, the fire pit hissed softly though it had not been stoked, and in the air the sound of wings, not heard but felt, like the echo of a roar long since shouted, still trembling in the marrow of stone. The egg was no longer an object, it was a will, and it had begun to choose. That evening, as the sun died in streaks of bronze and violet, they gathered at the high plateau that overlooked the forest's heart. From there, the horizon spilled wide, showing the sprawl of Westeros in a silhouette of forgotten kingdoms and flickering fires. Illyrius placed the egg upon a stone dais carved with symbols now glowing faintly in response. Though none of them could read their meaning, she looked not at the egg but at the sky, her silver hair stirring in the breeze, as though it too had heard the call. Caden stood behind her, his hands clasped, saying nothing. There was nothing more to teach, nothing left to fear. Then the light shifted. The egg flared once, white-hot and silent, and then cracked with a sound like thunder muffled beneath 1,000 years of snow. A web of fissures raced across its surface, each one glowing like molten gold. Illyrius stepped forward, drawn by something more instinct than thought, her breath catching in her throat, and from within, with the quiet authority of something ancient and sovereign, came a cry, not a scream, not a shriek, but a note of it was not loud, but it filled the air as completely as wind fills sails, as completely as memory fills grief. The dragon that emerged was not large, no larger than a hunting hound. Its wings were slick with membrane that shimmered in hues of copper and shadow, and its eyes, golden as dawn, slit with pupils like obsidian, met Illyrius with the calm recognition of kin. Smoke curled from its nostrils as it took its first breath, and its scales crackled as though flame danced just beneath them. It did not roar, it did not stumble, it stood, regal, poised, as though it had always known it would be born in this place, at this hour, to this woman. Valeris knelt, tears running silently down her cheeks, her hands open and trembling. The dragon stepped forward, its claws clicking softly on the stone, and placed its head beneath her palm. The contact was electric, not painful but pure, as if the world around them stilled to witness the meeting of soul and flame. In that moment, something vast passed between them. Language beyond speech, thought beyond understanding. She saw skies that had not yet existed, cities yet to burn, and love bound not by blood, but by fire. Caden turned away, not out of fear or disbelief, but out of reverence. He had seen miracles in books, had dreamed of them in his youth, and now stood in the presence of one made flesh. His tears fell freely, unashamed. "The world has turned again," he whispered, voice hoarse. "The wheel, it breaks itself anew." They stayed there through the night, girl and dragon and maester, beneath stars that seemed brighter for the event they had watched unfold. The dragon did not sleep, though it curled around Valeris like a shadow remembering its source. It watched the dark with eyes that shimmered, not with menace, but with memory. And Valeris, who had always known herself to be more than legend, more than name, now knew the truth. She was the bridge between extinction and rebirth, not a conqueror, not a savior, something else, something quieter, something inevitable. But the wind, which had been gentle, now carried whispers. Far away, in keeps both noble and crumbling, ravens stirred uneasily in their cages. In the north, the direwolves howled, not at the moon, but at something older, something they did not recognize. In the free cities, alchemists found their potions souring in their jars, and seers screamed in the night from dreams they could not recall. A presence had returned to the world, one that did not knock at the door, but simply was. And with its arrival came the oldest of questions. Now that the dragon is born, what shall become of the fire? They left the Vale of Nalar in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because words could no longer carry what had passed between them and the world. Valeris did not ride now. She walked, her steps slow, deliberate, and full of a stillness that came not from hesitance, but from awe. At her side the dragon followed, not tethered, not trained, but drawn, as though a thread bound their fates together. Unseen, unbreakable, spun from something older than time. Its name had not yet been spoken aloud, for naming a creature born of fire and memory felt like painting a storm with a single brush. And yet she knew its name all the same. It sat at the edge of her thoughts, just beyond the veil of language, pulsing with the same rhythm as her breath. There was no command between them, no hierarchy, only a bond, a shared knowing that what had been begun in fire would not end in silence. Caden followed a few paces behind, his robes stained with travel, his beard threaded with gray and ash. He looked smaller now, but not diminished, rather humbled by the enormity of what he had witnessed. He was a maester no longer, not truly. The weight of his chain had long since become a burden too narrow for the breadth of truth. In his eyes was a deep sorrow, not for himself, but for the world that had forgotten how to believe. He had devoted a lifetime to reason, to the careful parsing of truth from tale, only to find that sometimes the story was the truth, and that belief, fragile and flickering, was the only light that could lead one through the darkness of unknowing. As they walked, the world around them seemed to bend and shift, not visibly, not in ways that others might notice, but in the quiet folds of nature. The trees leaned inward, listening. The streams ran slower, as if trying to catch the rhythm of their footsteps. The birds no longer fled at the sight of flame, but instead circled above, watchful, curious. Even the wind had changed. It no longer howled or sighed, but moved like a breath taken by something vast, thoughtful, waiting. And through it all, the dragon grew. Not in size, though each day its wings stretched broader, its scales deepened in hue, but in presence. It moved with the poise of old kings, with the gaze of a creature who had been born knowing its place in a song yet to be sung. News, too, began to reach them, echoes of the world reacting to their silent advance. Villagers along the river spoke in hushed tones of lights in the sky, of dreams shared by those who had never met, of animals gathering at the edge of clearings, staring into the fire with eyes that shimmered like embers. One man, a hermit who lived alone in a ruined sept, wept when he saw Aelari's pass. "She has the eyes," he whispered, bowing low enough that his forehead touched the earth. "The dragon sees through her. We are not forgotten." Another, a baker's wife with more sense than superstition, offered bread and salt without question, her hands trembling as she laid them before the beast. "I dreamed of her," she said softly, "long ago when I was still a girl, a woman with silver hair and a creature made of light and smoke. I thought it was madness, but here you are." Not all reactions were kind. In a larger town by the weeping river, a hedge knight made the mistake of drawing steel, thinking coin might follow if he brought her in chains to some old lord with a grudge against her blood. The dragon did not kill him. Aelaris did not command it. But fire answered fear, as it always had, and by the time the man fled, his sword was a molten stub, and his pride had turned to ash. After that, they moved more carefully, avoiding the roads that bore banners and coin, for though wonder stirred the hearts of many, power always drew the kind of men who did not seek to understand, only to possess. In the evenings, when the world grew quiet and the stars bled into the ink of night, Aelaris would sit beside her dragon and speak, not in command, not in praise, but as one might speak to a friend who shared their silence. She told it stories she had read in the old towers of Dragonstone, of kings who had flown on wings of fire and daughters who walked in shadows. She whispered tales of betrayal, of love lost in war, of mothers who wept over bones and fathers who burned kingdoms to feel something other than grief. She did not hide the truth from it. She did not speak of glory, but of burden, and the dragon listened, eyes like molten gold reflecting the firelight, as though it too remembered those stories, as though it had lived them once, before flame turned to legend and stone closed around the past. One night, as the fire crackled low and Caden lay dreaming beneath a patchwork of stars, Aelari's felt something shift inside her. Not pain, not fear, a tearing, yes, but not of flesh, of veil, of boundary. She saw herself not in her own eyes, but through others. She saw her face in the dreams of a boy in Dorne who wept at the sight of her and did not know why. She heard her name whispered in the Red Keep, where an old woman lit a candle in the godswood and said, "Let her be kinder than the last." She felt the chill of the wall as a raven stirred and looked east. And in the crypts of Winterfell, something old turned in its stone sleep. The dragon raised its head, sensing the shift. "You feel it too," she murmured, placing her hand on the creature's brow. A flicker of flame danced at the corner of its lips. A sound, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh, rumbled from its chest. She closed her eyes and for the first time did not dream of flying. She dreamed of choosing, because power, as she was learning, was not in flame or flight. It was not in awe or fear. Power was in choice, in the burden of knowing what one could do and deciding what one must. And the fire within her, once thought to be destiny's inheritance, was becoming something else entirely. It was a promise, and promises are always kept by fire. They came upon the ruins of Tessenhall at the turn of the waning moon, a place spoken of in half-breaths by the few old enough to recall its name. It had once been a seat of learning, a stronghold of scrolls and whispered truths, where Targaryens had studied the ancient art of dragon lore, not through conquest, but contemplation. Now it lay broken beneath a thicket of brambles and ivy, its proud columns shattered like fallen soldiers, its archways twisted by time and neglect. But even ruined, even forgotten, the bones of Tessenhall hummed, with a low, steady thrum, as though the stone itself had kept breathing through the centuries, holding its breath until she arrived. Valeris passed beneath its crumbling gate without hesitation, the dragon at her heels, silent save for the faint crackle of heat that shimmered in its wake. Caden followed slowly, his eyes wide not with wonder but with recognition, for though he had never walked these halls, he had read of them, dreamed of them, and in those dreams the stones were whole, and the halls rang with voices lost to ash. They made their shelter in what remained of the inner sanctum, a half-cabacked amphitheater where once maesters had gathered to listen to the oldest of tongues. The walls bore sigils worn smooth by wind and time, and at the center stood a dais blackened by old fire, as if some final rite had gone unfinished. It was there that Aelaris placed her hands, palms flat against the scorched surface, and closed her eyes. She did not speak. She did not need to. The flame that lived within her stirred, not in anger, not in triumph, but in recognition. Here, in this place where memory had outlived even names, she felt the line of her ancestors not as a burden, but as a pulse, threading through her bones, rising through the soles of her feet and into her blood like heat through iron. She could see them, not as portraits or myths, but as people. Rhaenys, barefoot in a garden of ash, Balon, whispering to a dying dragon, whose wings had never flown, Daenerys, tears on her cheeks as she stared into the fire and did not flinch. Each of them had carried the weight. Each of them had bent beneath it, and now it was her turn to stand. The dragon circled the dais, wings tucked tight, its body coiled like living flame. It watched her with eyes that flickered not just with heat, but with understanding. It had grown in size and spirit. Its wings now cast shadows long enough to reach across rooms, and when it moved, it did so with the silent certainty of a creature that had been born of prophecy, not chance. Caden, who had once scribbled lines about draconic taxonomy and scoffed at the stories of sentient beasts, no longer dared speak unless spoken to in the presence of the dragon. Not out of fear, but reverence. He had seen the creature bend its neck beside Aelaris when she wept. He had heard it utter low, mournful sounds when the wind carried the stench of war from afar, and most of all he had seen how it watched her, not as a beast to a master, but as one soul to another, bound not by domination, but by choice. They remained in Tessenhall for 3 days, as if the ruins themselves had something to teach, something to impart before they moved on. Aolaris wandered its fallen corridors, tracing the outlines of old mosaics with fingers that trembled only slightly. One morning she discovered a hidden alcove where the remnants of a mural still clung to life. 3 dragons, painted in the style of the freehold, flying over a map of Westeros. Beneath them were inscribed the words, "All things born of flame return to it." She stared at those words for a long while, then turned to Caden, who had followed her in silence. "Do you think that's a warning?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think it's a truth. Whether that truth brings ruin or redemption depends on who holds the flame." That night the dreams came harder, not just hers. Caedon, who had never dreamed beyond the practical mutterings of old scrolls and ink-stained regrets, woke gasping, with a name on his lips, a name he did not recognize, but which echoed with the weight of old blood. He did not speak of it. He merely rose, walked to the fire, and watched Aelaris sleep, her hand resting lightly on the dragon's scaled back, her expression serene but taut, as though her mind walked tightropes through thunder. Beyond the walls of Tessenhall, the world began to churn. In the Reach, crops that had grown stubbornly stunted now burst into bloom with unnatural speed, though their fruit bore a taste of smoke. In the Eyrie, the winds began to howl with voices that spoke only in the old tongue of Valyria. In Old Town, a young novice burned her hands on a book she had not touched, a tome about dragons thought to have been sealed with iron and spell. The land was not simply changing, it was remembering. Aelaris, though still young, had become something more than herself. She was a fulcrum now, and the realm was beginning to tip. They left the ruins with dawn, heading east toward the Fingers, where the cliffs met the sea in jagged crescents. Word had reached them, carried by a girl whose eyes never blinked and who swore the stars had mouths, that a gathering was forming there. Not a rebellion, not a court, something quieter, older. Dreamers, the girl had said. Whisperers. Those who had seen a silver-haired woman in their sleep and knew, without knowing how, that she must be found. Aelaris did not speak as the girl spoke. She simply nodded once, as if the meeting had already been planned, not by her, but by something far beyond them all. As they traveled, more joined them. Not many. A wandering singer whose voice summoned fireflies even in daylight. A stonemason who claimed his dreams had led him to carve dragons into the walls of inns without knowing why. A woman of the north, silent and tall, who bore a sort of old steel and whose eyes shimmered faintly in moonlight. Each came with a different story, a different shard of the same mirror. They followed not for glory, not for coin, but because they felt it, because some things are not followed but recognized. The dragon watched them all without challenge, as though it had already seen their faces carved into the branches of fate. And so the caravan grew, a small flame moving across a sea of darkening land. Aelaris did not lead it with speeches or banners. She walked quietly, her gaze on the horizon, her dragon at her side. But in her silence was command, and in her presence people found themselves believing in things they had long buried beneath the weight of cynicism and dust. They began to speak of her not as a queen, not yet, but as something else, something elemental, the flame bearer, the daughter of return. the keeper of the last fire. She did not correct them, because deep within, she too had begun to understand. This was not about her. It was about the fire that was rising again. The fingers greeted them with wind that howled like a grieving widow, and cliffs carved by time into jagged teeth that drank the salt from the sea and whispered of old sorrows. Here the land seemed raw, unfinished, as if the gods had once reached out with colossal hands to pull the stone into shape but had left the work undone, departing in silence. The caravan made its slow descent along the narrow paths, their footsteps careful on the shale that broke like glass beneath their boots. Aelorys walked at the front, her cloak pulled tightly around her shoulders, the dragon flying ahead in slow, circling passes that scattered seabirds into the gusting sky. Behind her, Caden and the others followed, and, though none spoke, their silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of things felt but not named, the kind of silence that comes before a storm or a prophecy fulfilled. They arrived at a cove hidden between two collapsed cliffs, where the rocks formed a natural amphitheater, cupping the sea in its arms like an ancient oracle. There were already people waiting, dozens of them, perhaps more, scattered across the stone ledges like wildflowers blooming from the cracks. They bore no heraldry, no banners, no crowns. Some were dressed in rags, others in robes that shimmered faintly with starlight. And all of them turned as one when Aelorys stepped onto the shore, as though her arrival had been etched into the tides themselves. Among them were children, their eyes bright with knowing. Old men who bowed without kneeling, women whose faces bore the marks of flame. Not burns, but patterns, as if kissed by fire in sleep. And when she passed among them, they did not call her name. They simply breathed. And the dragon, silent in the sky, descended and landed without a sound, curling around the great stone that marked the center of the cove, like a guardian returning to its throne. That night a fire was lit, not by flint or spark, but by breath. Aelorys stood by the stone, her hand raised, and the dragon opened its mouth and exhaled, not a torrent of destruction, but a single line of pure golden flame that danced like a ribbon and caught upon the ancient wood laid at the base of the stone. The fire bloomed upward in a great flower of light, casting flickering shadows across the faces gathered in the dark. No songs were sung, no prayers were spoken, but in the glow of the flame, a stillness settled that felt sacred, not because it was demanded, but because it was understood. And then she spoke. Her voice was low, steady, not commanding, but undeniable. She did not speak of war, though the world would soon call for it. She did not promise crowns or kingdoms. What she offered was far stranger, far more terrible and beautiful, a remembering. She spoke of a world before conquest, before thrones were hammered from the bones of dragons. She spoke of the old pact between flame and sky, between rider and beast, between people and the fire that could destroy or heal. She told them that the fire had not died, only slept, that it had waited not for armies, but for hearts brave enough to burn and still remain whole. She told them that she did not come to take, but to witness, to awaken, and they listened. Some wept, their tears falling silently onto stone. Others closed their eyes and saw visions of things they could not name, wings slicing through thunderclouds, towers made of molten glass, voices that spoke not in words, but in color. Aelorys stood among them, not as a queen, but as a mirror, showing them the flame that had always lived inside, waiting only to be seen. When she finished, no one applauded, no one cheered. They simply bowed their heads and pressed their hands to the earth, to the sea, to their own hearts. And the fire in the center burned higher, not consuming. That was the beginning. The days that followed were not filled with conquest, but with awakening. People came from farther and farther afield, drawn not by proclamation, but by dreams. They brought with them old songs, lost languages, fragments of prophecy scrawled in ash and ink. Some came wounded, not in body but in spirit. Nobles cast out by shifting politics, warriors haunted by the faces of those they could not save, mothers who had buried too many children. They came carrying burdens, and in Aelaris's presence they found not release, but recognition. The dragon walked among them now, not as a terror, but as a mystery, brushing its snout against children's hands, curling in the sand beside the dying, offering warmth where once it would have brought ruin. Cadon, who had lived his life in service to knowledge, found himself unlearning more than he taught. He no longer tried to understand the magic that swirled around Aelaris. He simply bore witness, transcribing not explanations, but truths. What we see now, he wrote one evening, as gulls cried over the waves, is not a return to the old world, but the arrival of one that has always waited, hidden beneath the ash. But word spreads, as all flame does, and far away in stone halls where lords still held their power like swords too long unsheathed, the old fear stirred. Ravens flew, bearing scrolls laced with suspicion. Some scoffed at the tales, a girl and her pet, a circus of fanatics. But others knew. The bloodlines were not so distant, the name was not so easily forgotten. Targaryen. It returned like a shadow cast by the past, long buried but never burned away, and they knew that fire, once ignited, does not stay in the hearth. They began to prepare, not for diplomacy, for war. And still Aelaris waited, not because she was idle, but because she understood something they did not, that the fire which comes too early burns out too fast, that some storms must be welcomed with open arms, not beaten back with shields. She did not sharpen her sword, she did not carry one. She did not gather armies, she gathered truth like kindling. She gathered faith like breath, and she waited, because the world, whether it knew it or not, was already burning. The first true challenge came not from steel or fire, but from doubt, not hers, but that of those who had begun to gather, drawn like moths to the quiet flame of her presence. It was not disbelief in her, not exactly. It was disbelief in themselves, in what they were becoming, in what the world would demand of them, should it choose to turn its full attention toward the growing spark at the edge of the realm. For fire is beautiful from afar, mesmerizing, sacred even, but up close it asks something terrible. It demands to be fed. And those who had knelt in awe beside the dragon's quiet strength now began to wonder if they were the kindling fate had chosen. Rumors began to rustle among the tents that dotted the cove, murmurs of spies, of blades drawn in the night, of old debts that might come due should they continue down this path. Some had joined for dreams, others for prophecy, but few had truly considered what would come when dream and prophecy were forced to wear the shape of blood. Aelaris felt this shift before it was spoken aloud. She sensed it in the hush between conversations. in the eyes that lingered too long on her dragon when they thought she wasn't looking, in the silence of campfires that once rang with laughter and song. She did not fear betrayal. It was not knives she dreaded, nor poison. It was the slow erosion of belief, the way a stone left in running water is shaped over time into something smaller, smoother, less true. Doubt was the enemy that wore a friendly face, that arrived not as a threat but as a sigh. And so she chose to meet it not with command but with presence. On the night of the new moon, when the sky was deepest and the wind had gone still, Aelari summoned them all to the central fire. She stood without armor, without crown, without dragon at her side, just herself, young, pale, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes filled not with light but with quiet. She did not speak for a long time, letting the silence wrap around them like a shroud, until even the waves dared not break upon the shore too loudly. When she did speak, her voice was soft, but it carried, not because it shouted, but because it resonated with the quiet within them. "I know what you fear," she said, "not me, not the dragon, but what comes after. What comes when they find us, when they name us heretics, rebels, traitors, when they say the old blood must be burned out once more. You fear that we are alone." Her eyes swept across the faces turned toward her, tired, weathered, hopeful, and afraid. "But we are not alone," she continued, "because they cannot kill what we have already become. They can strike at bodies, but not memory. They can burn pages, but not truth. What we carry is not a weapon. It is a wound the world has tried to forget and now remembers. We are not here to fight. We are here to remind them. The dragon came then, not summoned, but drawn by the pulse of her words, and landed beside her, folding its wings in a gesture that was both fierce and gentle. It curled around the fire, and its golden eyes met hers with a quiet, powerful certainty. She placed a hand on its back and closed her eyes. "We will not march on castles. We will not demand crowns. Let the kings play their games of ash and bone. Let them fortify their walls. We will go to the places they have forgotten, the broken villages, the haunted hills, the people who are never named in songs. We will bring the fire there not to destroy but to warm. And if they come for us, let them come. We will not meet them with war." She opened her eyes, and in them there was no anger, only flame. "We will meet them with truth." The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of something that tasted like strength, like resolve, like peace forged in fire, not sharpened like a blade, but shaped like a shield. The fear did not vanish, but it changed. It became something different, something bearable, because now they knew. They were not soldiers, they were beacons. And so the path changed. They moved inland, not as a host, but as a whisper, a slow, wandering procession of believers, doubters, healers, poets, children. They passed through villages where hunger was a permanent house guest and left behind gardens that bloomed in 3 days. They slept in woods where the crows had grown silent and woke to find them singing. Aelari healed no wounds, cast no spells. She simply walked, and where she walked, the land remembered. The old stones grew warm. The trees whispered again. Forgotten gods stirred beneath the soil and blinked ancient eyes. It was in one such village, little more than a collection of broken cottages perched on a marsh, that they first encountered true resistance. A knight, clad in tarnished armor marked with the sun of the Reach, barred their way across a bridge. He was not cruel, but proud, and behind his eyes lived the memory of dead kings and better days. "This road is not for you," he said, his hand resting on his sword. "You bring fire where there is no room for it. The people here want bread, not dreams." Ellery stepped forward alone. She did not speak for a long moment. Then, softly, she asked, "Do they? Have you asked them?" The knight frowned, uncertain. She passed him without force, only silence, and stepped into the village. She went door to door, not to preach, but to listen. She knelt beside an old woman whose son had vanished in the night and held her hand until the woman remembered how to cry. She sat with a boy who had never spoken and sang to him until his mouth moved in quiet imitation. The knight watched from the edge of the marsh, his hand never leaving the hilt of his sword, but he did not follow. That night the villagers built a fire. Not a great blaze, a small flame, enough to see each other by, and the knight laid down his sword and joined them. Not long after, he began to walk behind Ellery's, saying nothing. The fire did not grow larger, it grew deeper, and in the dark halls of power, where lords schemed and queens whispered, where scrolls bore the weight of ancient laws and bastards were sent to bleed in the name of forgotten banners, the word began to spread, not as a scream, but as a rumor. A silver-haired girl with a dragon and no crown was waking the land from its sleep, not with war, with fire that did not burn. Yet in the deepening hush of autumn, when the leaves burned brighter than any forge, and the winds carried with them the sharp perfume of endings, Iolaris and her quiet procession reached the old riverlands of the Trident. This was a place soaked in history and sorrow, where blood had mingled with water so many times that the soil itself seemed reluctant to offer anything but reeds and stone. The fields were wide, the sky endless, and yet everything here felt coiled, held tight beneath a skin of memory. No battles raged in those days, but there were wounds that had never closed. And as the caravan came upon village after village, they found not hostility but weariness, eyes dulled by loss, voices hollowed by the echo of names no longer spoken. These were people who had long since ceased to believe in the possibility of change, not because they were cynical, but because hope had been taken from them so often that they had simply stopped reaching for it. Ellery did not speak to these people as a leader. She did not promise a new dawn or whisper of thrones. Instead, she sat with them, on stone steps, in the dirt of fallow fields, beneath the low roofs of huts where children slept 3 to a bed. She listened. Sometimes she offered only silence. Other times she would hum a song that no one remembered learning, yet which always made the air feel warmer, and occasionally, when the fire was just right and the night still enough, she would tell stories, not of herself, not of dragons, but of other fires, small ones, quiet ones, the kind that lived in the hearts of people too stubborn to die, too gentle to turn away from suffering. The dragon had grown now into something impossible to ignore. Its wings cast shadows like sails upon the earth, and its breath could heat stone until it glowed. Yet it remained calm, coiled beside her at each stop like a sentinel carved from copper and smoke. Children approached it without fear. Elders watched it with something close to reverence. And though it had never been given a name in ceremony, the people had begun to call it something in their own tongues. Thala in the old tongue of the river folk, meaning ember that waits. Aelyrus did not correct them. She felt the truth in it. The dragon was not a weapon. It was a threshold. But the world was not death. Far to the south, the Queen of the Reach summoned her bannermen with quiet urgency, her green eyes glinting above sealed scrolls. In the Eyrie, the High Lords began to study their old treaties with Valyria, as though the ink might rise again to warn them of what was to come. And in King's Landing, the Iron Throne, twisted and ancient, cold with centuries of blood and ambition, received its first true tremor in years, not from battle, not from fire, but from unease. The realm had long prepared for rebellion, for usurpers brandishing steel and raising banners. It had not prepared for a girl who did not seek a throne, who raised no armies, who burned nothing, and yet whose presence moved the people more deeply than any coronation ever could. The raven they sent to her was wrapped in velvet and bore the seal of the Hand himself. It arrived at dusk, its wings whispering against the fading sun, and landed not with fear, but with a strange resignation. Caden took the scroll, unrolled it beneath the flickering torchlight, and read it aloud with a voice that did not waver. To Aelyrus of House Targaryen, called by some flame-bearer, known now to many more, you are hereby summoned to appear before the throne at King's Landing. The realm acknowledges your heritage, your journey, and your claim, though none has been made. It seeks understanding. It seeks peace. Come not as a threat, but as a guest. Come alone. There was silence, deep and layered. Around the fire, those who had walked beside her stiffened, not with anger, but with concern. The word alone was heavy. It was the language of diplomacy, laced with blades. Aelyrus stared at the fire for a long time. Then, softly, without emotion, she said, "They do not understand." Kaidun stepped beside her, placing the letter in the flames, watching as it curled into ash. "They think this ends at a throne." She nodded once, slowly. "They still think the fire must be claimed." He looked at her then, not as her teacher nor her protector, but as one soul looking upon another, both marked by years and flame. "And what will you do?" She rose. "Go." The next morning she left the camp, not secretly but quietly. The dragon followed, as did Caden and a handful of those who could not be asked to stay behind, not because they were loyal, but because their hearts had already been woven into the path she now walked. They moved without pageantry, without escort, through the misty hills toward the capital. Along the way they passed the remnants of older fires, fields once scorched by dragon flame, castles rebuilt from rubble, statues half melted by wrath. History whispered around them with every step, and yet nothing felt more certain than this moment. King's Landing shimmered in the distance like a city dreaming of its own importance. The red keep rose high, its spires reaching for the clouds like accusations carved from stone. The people lined the streets as she passed, but there were no cries of treason, no stones thrown, just silence. Curiosity, a strange unspoken pull. Mothers clutched children tighter, men stepped back, not in fear but in deference, and in every window a flicker of firelight seemed to shimmer just a little brighter, as though the city itself had drawn breath and was holding it. At the gates of the keep, she stopped. The dragon unfurled its wings, exhaled a single puff of smoke, and lay down beside the road. Aelores stepped forward alone, her cloak trailing behind her like shadow, her silver hair catching the wind. She passed beneath the portcullis, and the guards did not move to stop her. They simply lowered their weapons, as though instinct whispered that to challenge her would be like spitting into a storm. She entered the throne room with no herald, no trumpet, no name spoken, and yet every voice fell silent the moment she stepped upon the stone. At the far end of the hall, the iron throne loomed, jagged, rusted, vast, and seated upon it, the king watched her approach, his face carefully neutral, but his hands white-knuckled where they gripped the armrests. She stopped halfway, her hands empty, her gaze calm. "I did not come to kneel," she said, her voice clear, echoing through the great hall like the sound of truth breaking stone. "I did not come to take." The court held its breath. She looked not at the throne, but at the people who surrounded it. Advisors, soldiers, nobles, all cloaked in silence and fear and expectation. "I came," she said, "because the fire has returned." And behind her, beyond the gates, beyond the walls, beyond the sea of stone and ash that had once ruled the realm, the wind changed. The world turned its face toward the flame once more. The silence in the throne room stretched long and taut, like a bowstring drawn to the point of shatter. Aelores stood in its center, a slender figure of flesh and fire, bearing no armor, no crown, no claim. Only presence. Around her, the nobility of Westeros shifted, uncomfortably in their fine robes and polished armor, caught between centuries of fear and the unfamiliar weight of awe. The Iron Throne itself loomed behind the king, a twisted monument of blades and ambition, forged in fire, yet never truly understanding it. And upon it sat a man who had inherited rule, but not reverence. His eyes sharp with calculation, his posture rigid, a hand resting lightly on the hilt of a sword he had never drawn in war. He looked at Aelores as one might regard a storm on the horizon, distant yet inevitable, beautiful but dangerous. She met his gaze with no challenge, no hatred, only a kind of deep, impossible sorrow. "You sit on a throne built from fear," she said, her voice unhurried, clear as wind through broken glass. "Not because you are cruel, but because that is what you were taught. That power must be taken, that peace must be enforced, that the fire exists only to burn." The king said nothing at first. Behind him, his counsel stirred like shadows, uncertain of where to settle. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, edged with doubt. "And what would you have us believe? That you bring salvation? That the dragon will rule with kindness? That your fire will warm us, not consume us?" Aelores stepped forward, and the sound of her boots upon the ancient stone rang louder than any reply. "I bring nothing," she said. "That is the truth of it. I carry no crown. I raise no banner. I have not come to replace you." She turned then, addressing the room, not the throne, but the eyes that watched from the alcoves and corners, the guards who held their breath, the scribes whose quills had stilled. "The fire that has returned is not mine. It belongs to the world. It always did. I am only its mirror." A murmur rippled through the chamber, uncertain, electrified. The air itself felt charged, thick with the sense that something vast and irrevocable had begun, not with thunder, not with bloodshed, but with a quiet declaration no less powerful than conquest. Cadon, standing far at the edge of the hall, understood in that moment what she had truly become, not a queen, not a tyrant, not a chosen one, but a reckoning, a reminder that the old power had never truly died, only gone silent, waiting for someone who would not use it, but answer it. Then came the sound, soft, like distant wind at first, then louder, undeniable, the cry of wings, the whisper of flame, and through the high, open arches above the throne, the dragon descended. Not in rage, not in war. It landed upon the stone with grace and might, its wings folding like a great cloak of night. The room shook, not with fear, but with the awe of witnessing something older than the stones themselves. The dragon lowered its head beside Alaris, its eyes closed, not in submission, but in unity. She reached out, resting her hand against its brow, and for a moment the room held its breath as fire met flesh, as history kissed the present. "You ask what I bring?" she said, without turning back to the king. "I bring choice." And that word, small as it seemed, thundered louder than any edict, because for too long the realm had lived under the illusion that power must be inherited or stolen, that rulers were born of blood, not truth. But here stood a woman who had carried fire across mountains and rivers, through fear and doubt, and had asked for nothing in return, not dominion, not allegiance, only the chance to be heard, only the chance to remind the world that fire could heal, not just destroy, that dragons were not beasts to be tamed, nor weapons to be unleashed, but hearts made flame, waiting for someone brave enough not to wield them, but to understand them. The king did not speak again that day. He did not rise. He did not order her seized or struck down. Instead, he sat in stillness as she turned and walked from the hall, the dragon at her side, the sound of their footsteps ringing like the end of a season. And when she stepped out into the square, the crowd that had gathered fell to quiet, not kneeling, not cheering, just watching, listening, Words spread not like wildfire, but like dawn. Villages painted her likeness in the glow of lanterns. Children sang of the flame that did not kill. Soldiers laid down swords not out of cowardice, but because their hands had learned gentler strength. And in the high halls of ancient families, once proud and brittle, voices began to ask, not who would sit the throne, but what the throne was meant to be. Alaris did not stay in King's Landing. She walked west, then north, then wherever the wind carried the ashes of old dreams and the seeds of new ones. The dragon flew above her like a comet, trailing warmth instead of fire. The people followed, not because they had been summoned, but because they saw something of themselves in her. The wounded, the weary, the watchers, the forgotten, and thus the flame endured. Not because it raged, but because it was shared. Not all stories end with crowns or death. Some end in quiet transformation, in the reshaping of breath and bone, in the long, patient weaving of a world that is no longer afraid of its own light. And somewhere, deep in the mountains, where snow meets stone and the stars seem close enough to touch, A dragon curled around its rider, and a woman with silver hair looked to the sky, not to command it, but simply to watch it burn.